So let's say you've been using VirtualBox for a while, and it does everything you want it to do. But some things can get tedious with it. Just setting up a new virtual machine with VirtualBox is quite a process. You need to get the ISO file. You need to create a new virtual machine. You need to go through the installation, and even when it's done, you're probably going to invest some more time fine-tuning your virtual machine and maybe install some tools on it. What if I told you that there is a better way? You're still going to enjoy everything VirtualBox has to offer, but you're going to launch new virtual machines much faster. You're going to automate most of the repetitive stuff. You're going to be able to launch several identical virtual machines with no extra work. And on top of that, you'll be given a platform to save your virtual machines for later use and to share them with your friends and coworkers. Let's dive in. So first, we need to install Vagrant. So let's head over to vagrantapp.com and let's choose Download. Vagrant can be installed on Linux, Windows, and macOS, so let's go ahead and install it. Now, I want to make it clear, Vagrant is not a standalone software. It's intended to speed up your workflow with virtual machines, make it more productive and less repetitive, but it cannot create virtual machines on its own. It relies on VirtualBox for that. To be completely accurate, it supports a few more hypervisors, such as VMware, but VirtualBox is the most widely used one when it comes to Vagrant, so that's the hypervisor I'll be focusing on. If you don't have VirtualBox installed yet, you're going to have to install it as well. Working with Vagrant involves mainly editing text files and using the terminal. You can use any text editor you want, but I'm going to use Visual Studio Code as it also has a built-in command line tool. First, let's create a folder for our Vagrant files. And let's initialize this folder to work with Vagrant. We can see that a new Vagrant file was created. And there is a bunch of comments here that give us basic introduction to what everything does. So I'm going to do the logical thing and just erase everything. Okay, that's better. So it's time to finally create our first Vagrant virtual machine. Let's go with Ubuntu 20.04. The codename for Ubuntu 20.04 is Focal Fossa. So as the box, I'll specify Ubuntu Focal 64. And to create the virtual machine, we're going to type Vagrant app. Okay, so when we create a virtual machine of a type we didn't create yet, it's going to take a bit longer because Vagrant has to download it, but this download usually only takes about 2 to 3 minutes. And we see that Vagrant sort of initialized the new virtual machine, and now it's done. To list the virtual machines we currently have, we can run Vagrant status. And here we have it. So the virtual machine has a name, which is default, as it's currently the only machine we have, and you can see that its state is running. How much time would we have to invest to get to the very same point using only VirtualBox? Probably at least 25 minutes. And here we did it in 3 minutes? That's pretty significant in my book. I want to clarify the terminology here, just to make sure we're all on the same page. There are two important keywords here, and it's important to distinguish between them. The first one is box. A Vagrant box is a template. That's what we download when we first create a virtual machine of a new type. It's a file we download once, and we can use it to create multiple virtual machines. All of the virtual machines that are based on the same box will be identical. The other keyword is virtual machine, and that's like the instantiation or implementation, because a box is nothing but a template. We cannot work with it directly. When we run Vagrant app, that's when Vagrant creates an actual virtual machine we can work with. that's based on the box we specified. In a similar fashion to the way we can list our virtual machines with Vagrant status, we can also list our boxes, and that's done with Vagrant box list. And right now we only have one box, Ubuntu/Focal64. So as we said, Vagrant is actually a front end, or an interface, that improves our interaction with the virtual machines. But in the background, it is VirtualBox that does most of the heavy lifting. So let's open VirtualBox. And we can see here, at the bottom of the list, the new virtual machine that we created with Vagrant. I recommend to not change anything in this virtual machine directly from VirtualBox. If you created the machine with Vagrant, it's probably best to only interact it via Vagrant. But seeing the machine in VirtualBox can help understand what's happening behind the scenes. The Ubuntu machine we created is the server version, so no graphical desktop. But we can easily log into it with SSH. To do that, we'll simply type Vagrant, SSH, and then the name of the virtual machine. Boom, we logged in. So the username is Vagrant, and the name of the machine is Ubuntu Focal. So what's displayed now is the shell of the virtual machine, and we're interacting with a fully functional Linux machine. So let's, for example, update our system. By the way, notice that even though I used sudo, I didn't have to type in a password. That's because the default Vagrant user doesn't have a password. Let's run neofetch. And we can see that we're running Ubuntu 20.04.3. To log out of the virtual machine and get back to the host operating system, we can type either exit or logout. Let's see how we can use Vagrant to easily share files between the host and the guest. We're going to use a little plugin called Vagrant SCP, so let's install it. Let's now create an example file on our Windows host. And to copy it to our Vagrant virtual machine, we just specify the file we want and then the name of the virtual machine. By the way, I removed the dot from the file name, so it won't be hidden in Linux. After a colon, we specify the path within the virtual machine. And here we see the file in the virtual machine. We can also create a synced folder. A synced folder is actually a shared folder, and it can be accessed from both the host and the guest. Let's first create a folder that we're going to share and place a file in it. And now let's share it with our virtual machine. As with any other configuration in Vagrant, we're going to do it by editing our Vagrant file. And it's as simple as adding one line to the config, and it's called synced folder. It uses two parameters. The first one is the path of the folder in the host, and the second one is the path in the guest. Since the machine is already up, we have to take it down for the synced folder to be established. So instead of halting it and then running Vagrant up, I can just run Vagrant reload. And let's SSH the virtual machine again. and we can see the files it contains, and we can also edit them. And the changes will be reflected to the host. Let's talk about networking for a minute. Let's check the IP addresses of both the host and the guest. And you can see that the host and the guest are in completely different networks. That's because by default, Vagrant uses something called NAT network. I talked about NAT networks in the previous video in this series. Take a look if you're interested. But the bottom line is that even though we can ping the host from the guest, the other way around won't work. To make the guest join the network the host is in, we're going to use a bridged network, in addition to the NAT network. To be more precise, bridged network is the term used by VirtualBox, whereas Vagrant uses the term public network. But they basically mean the same thing. To make the virtual machine join the public network, we need to add a line to its configuration. The thing is that the host has more than one network adapter, so we need to specify which one of them is the one we want the virtual machine to be bridged to. In my case, I want the virtual machine to join the Wi-Fi network, so let's specify it. And we also need to ask the virtual machine to auto-retrieve an IP address from the DHCP server. Let's reload the machine. And if we check the IP of the virtual machine now, we see that the virtual machine is now connected to an additional network with an IP in the same network as the host. In VirtualBox itself, we can see that the virtual machine now uses two network adapters, one for the NAT network and the other one for the bridge network, and now we will be able to ping the virtual machine from the host and vice versa. I want to emphasize though that Vagrant uses the NAT network for some of the services it provides, such as Vagrant SSH. That's why in addition to the bridge network, we also have NAT, and it's important that we keep it. Until now, we've only used one virtual machine, the one in Vagrant named default. Let's see how we can name our virtual machines ourselves and create more than just one. But first, let's see how we can kill a virtual machine we created earlier. To do it, we're going to use the Vagrant destroy command. And we need to confirm that we really want to delete this machine. And it was stopped and deleted. And if we run Vagrant status now, we see that we don't have any Vagrant virtual machines. Let's now see how we can create a virtual machine with a specific name. I'll call my VM absprog1. To do that, we need the define keyword. Let's run Vagrant app to create the virtual machine. And the name of our virtual machine is absprog1, just as we wanted. And if we want a second virtual machine, absprog2. For this, we're going to use the do keyword. And keep in mind that each do block must be closed with a corresponding end. Notice that we have to write the name of the virtual machine a second time with these vertical brackets right after the do keyword. Let's run Vagrant app to create the new machine. And we now have two running virtual machines. Notice that having two virtual machines doesn't stop us from using any other configuration. If, for example, we want our virtual machines to have access to the public bridge network, we can add it, just as we did before. And if we would run Vagrant reload now, both of the virtual machines would be added to the bridge network. But sometimes we want different virtual machines to have different configurations. For example, we might want the first virtual machine to share one folder with the host and the other virtual machine to share another folder. If we would add the synced folder as a general configuration, the same folder will be available to both of the virtual machines. But as we said, we want each of them to have access to a different folder. So let's create the second folder. And now we need to move the configuration that we want to only be applied to a specific virtual machine to the block of this virtual machine. But it's not enough. And if we would start the virtual machines with this configuration, both of the machines would get access to both of the folders. That's because config is used for general configurations. We need to use the name of the machine if we want the configuration to apply to a specific machine. Let's see a usage example. Let's say that we want to develop two websites, and we want the first website to be served with Apache and the second website to be served with Nginx. Let's start by removing the virtual machines we currently have. And let's create the shared folders on the host. Both Apache and Nginx use the folder var www.html for the files they serve, so this is the folder in the guest that I want to be synced. One more thing we need to take care of is accessing the guests from the host. One option is using a public bridge network, as we saw before. This will make the virtual machines join the network the host is in, so we will be able to access them using their IPs. But I want to show an alternative option, and that's using port forwarding. It basically means that every request to some specific ports on the host will be forwarded to some other ports on the virtual machine. Both Apache and Nginx use port 80 by default, so that's the port we will forward to, and let's forward port 8001 to the Apache machine and port 8002 to the Nginx machine. To forward the port, we use the network configuration with the forward port key. And then we need to specify the ports for the guest and for the host. Let's now log into the Apache machine and install Apache, then log into the Nginx machine and install Nginx. Let's now try to access port 8001 on our host. And we see the Apache welcome screen. And if we try to access port 8002, we get the Nginx welcome screen. So in a few moments, we set up a development environment with two different web servers and without contaminating our host. We can easily scrap them and stay with a fresh machine as if we never installed anything. Let's see what the virtual machines put in their shared folders. And you can see index.html. This way, we can develop our website and test it right from the host without logging into the virtual machine. So I can, for example, change some text in this file. And if we get back to the Apache website, we can see the change. The same thing can be done with the Nginx website. A really nice feature is being able to run a command as soon as the virtual machine is created. So let's say that this setup of two virtual machines, one for Apache and one for Nginx, is something we use a lot. So we want to save our Vagrant file, so next time we can just Vagrant up and everything will be ready. What could be really cool is if the virtual machines would install their corresponding web server upon creation. To do that, we're going to use the shell provisioner. And here we're going to use an inline script, which means that we're just going to write it. There is also an option to provide a path to some script that can be found somewhere else, but for a web server installation, the inline option makes a lot of sense. Let's destroy the virtual machines we currently have, then try this on-the-fly installation. And it took a few minutes, but the entire setup was created from scratch, according to our Vagrant file. And you can see that indeed the web servers are up and running. But what if we don't want to use Ubuntu? Let's say, for example, that for some reason the Nginx server must be hosted on Debian, but we still want Apache to be hosted on Ubuntu. This would be quite easy to do. We just need to move the box we choose from the general configuration to the boxes themselves. And instead of Ubuntu, I'll choose Debian Bullseye. And now Apache is installed on an Ubuntu machine, whereas Nginx is installed on a Debian one. So we've been using our virtual machines for a while, but we didn't pay much attention to the resources that were allocated to them. So let's see what we've got. So the Debian machine has 2 CPUs allocated to it and about half a gigabyte of RAM. And the Ubuntu machine also has 2 CPUs allocated to it, but it has about 1 gigabyte of RAM. So out the box, not every Vagrant virtual machine will have the same resources, but as with more settings, it can be configured. Here, I configured the machines to use 2 CPUs and 2 GB of RAM each, and I can Vagrant reload for the new settings to take effect. So we've already used an Ubuntu box and a Debian one, and you must be wondering, how did I know the exact names of these boxes, and are there any more where these two came from? And here lies much of the power of Vagrant. Vagrant has a website that hosts many of these boxes, and each of them can be downloaded and used in a matter of minutes. So let's head over to vagrantapp.com, and now we're going to choose Find Boxes. And it's really nice, it's like you go shopping, and there is quite a lot to choose from. So if, for example, I want Ubuntu 21.10, I can search for it. And as you can see, there are many results. The first one is the official Ubuntu build, but we're not limited to it. And as we can see, many people uploaded their own boxes. These additional boxes were usually based on the official one, but something was changed there. Maybe some software was installed, maybe something was tweaked so the box will work in some environment. Every box has its own story. All of the search results are public, and we can download them. So if, for example, I want the official build, I can see the exact name of the box. Not all of the distros update their Vagrant boxes regularly. If we look for something like Rocky Linux, we see that there are quite a lot of options to download, but the official build is quite outdated. So until now, we've only interacted with our Vagrant virtual machines via the terminal, and that is the more widespread use of it, using the Vagrant virtual machines as servers. But it doesn't mean that we can't use Vagrant for virtual machines with a graphical desktop. Many Vagrant boxes are of desktop distros. Let's look, for example, for Ubuntu 20.04 desktop. And the first option has quite a lot of downloads and was fairly recently released. So let's go ahead and choose it as our box. But since we want to interact with a desktop, we also need to tell Vagrant to fire it up when the virtual machine loads, instead of starting the default headless mode. And our desktop virtual machine is up and running. The password, by the way, was Vagrant, just like the user. One last thing I want to talk about is how we can package our own virtual machines in a Vagrant box. The best way to start is probably from an existing Vagrant box. Nothing stops you from packaging any VirtualBox virtual machine. But to work properly, Vagrant assumes a lot of things. Just to name a few, it needs the Vagrant user, it requires port forwarding for SSH, and there are more things that need to be the way they are supposed to be. So it's probably best to use an existing Vagrant box as your starting point. Let's create a box for our Debian machine. The thing is that we need the name of the machine in VirtualBox itself, not in Vagrant. So let's find it. And let's now package it in a Vagrant box. And it's done. And if we list the files now, we see package.box, which is the Vagrant box. Let's rename it so it will better represent our Debian machine. The nice thing about this file is that it's not too big, about 300 megabytes. So you can save it, for example, on a small USB flash drive and copy it to your coworker's computer. Given that your coworker also has Vagrant installed, he will be able to create a virtual machine that's based on this box. So both of you will develop on identical environments. In our case, it doesn't make too much sense to use this box because it's based on a virtual machine that we already have. But let's assume just for a minute that we're on the coworker's computer. So let's add this box to the available Vagrant boxes. And if we list our boxes now, we can see it, and now we can use it to generate virtual machines just as we use the boxes from the Vagrant cloud. But what if your coworker doesn't sit next to you? What if you can't just hand over a USB flash drive? In this case, you can upload the virtual machine to the Vagrant cloud. First, you'll have to create an account and log in. Once you're logged in, you'll get access to the Vagrant dashboard. Here you can see all of the boxes you uploaded, and you can also upload new ones. So let's create a new one. We need to name our box. And we can also add a description, and then we can continue to creating the box. We need to specify the version of the machine. And then we need to add a provider. For provider, I'll choose VirtualBox. And then we need to choose the box file. Once the download is done, we will be able to see the new box in the dashboard. But we can see that it says no released versions. To release the version, let's choose the box. And here we can see that we have version 1.0 and it's unreleased. To make it accessible, we need to release it. And if we get back to the dashboard now, we can see it here. Anyone can now look for the box and find it in their search results. and they can use this box in their Vagrant file and generate virtual machines that are based on this box. But what if your box contains sensitive information and you don't want to share it with the world? In this case, you might want to consider using a private box. Private boxes are a paid service, but they allow you to easily save your Vagrant boxes in the Vagrant cloud privately, so no one else can use them. If you go with the organization plan, you can also share them with your team. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.